What's up guys, my name is Robin and I make stuff. Today we're going to be practicing mixing colors with a pretty basic palette. Here's a list of the colors that we're going to be using today. If you're just starting out, this is the exact color palette that I recommend for all of my students. You can make virtually any color of paint that you want just using these colors. So we're going to do 3 different scenes for our painting today. I'm taking one sheet of paper, I'm going to divide it into 3 separate sections, and then we're going to paint 3 totally different scenes using different techniques for each of those scenes. So without further ado, let's get into it. I'm going to start by taping off my paper as usual. I'm going to divide it into 3 equal sections. It does not have to be perfect, just eyeball it if you would like to. For this first section, it's going to be a desert scene. We're going to start off with wet on wet and do a nice blue sky. So I wet my whole section. I got some ultramarine blue, and I'm going to start with the darkest blue on the top and work my way down until it's virtually paintless on the bottom. So if you find that this paint is just continuing to spread in the dark value all the way down, don't be afraid to clean your brush off and lift a little bit of that paint up, working your way in the opposite direction until you get it just smooth enough so that it will blend into the water at the bottom and basically disappear. Now, while it's wet, you can actually dab a paper towel on here or use a paintbrush that is clean and dry to lift out some of the paint and create some clouds. This is a really fun technique to use. If you haven't tried it, this is a great opportunity to just give it a go. Wad up your paper towel, dab it in a few places. You can even use the paper towel to wipe some of the paint if you'd like. Lots of different ways to define clouds. Let's move on to the second section, which is going to be an ocean scene. So doing wet on wet, I'm going to start with blue on the top and pulling that down to just about 2/3 of the way down where it starts to really disappear. So a little bit smaller section of blue here, and working it down, the darkest at the top. And then as we get down to kind of the middle, we really want that to fade away. We're going to get some red. I'm using Alizarin Crimson, and I'm going to put a little bit of that here, kind of 2/3, 3/4 of the way down, and work it both up and down. So I want that to again bleed into the wet paper that I have and work itself into the blue and then down below. And I went a little bit darker, got a little bit more water, and now I'm going to clean off my brush because we're going to add orange. So this is going to be our sunset scene. So we add orange above where the red starts to fade and then also below. And we're doing it below because this is going to be a reflection in the ocean, and we want that orange to show through a little bit later in our water texture. We're sandwiching this red with orange. We're going to move on to the mountain scene with the trees. For this, I want it to feel a little more wintry, so I want this blue to be a little more winter gray blue. So I mixed some burnt sienna in that color. I made that color first, and then I did my wet on wet. I'm going to start with the darkest color at the top, and you can see that it's more of a dark gray blue, and I'm going to work that down about halfway, very similar to what we did with the ocean scene. But I want the darkest color to be at the top to where it fades into virtually nothing, about halfway down. You find that it's not fading away, again, just rinse your brush, dry it off in a paper towel, and just work that paint down gradually until it feels like it disappears. Now I did a few little cross swoops there because it didn't necessarily matter if it was straight or not. Make sure your paper is fully dried off before you go back to the first scene. Now I've got a little bit of blue, it's very light, and I'm going to just add some depth and dimension and darker value to these clouds. I want to soften up that paint just a little bit, so I cleaned my brush, dried it off on a paper towel, and I'm just softening some of those hard edge brush stroke lines in here so that it blends into the sky just a little bit more. But again, just trying to create value, softening up those edges. I don't want those hard edges. Now we're going to paint the prairie or the desert part of this scene. I'm using yellow ochre or raw sienna. I'm just getting that a little bit wet. I'm going to take that straight across and make a box with it, essentially. So we're just going to paint that all the way straight across, a nice straight line. That's also why you want your paper to be nice and dry for this. If your sky is wet, that yellow ochre, that raw sienna is going to bleed into the sky. You're not going to get that crisp line, and that's what we're going for. We want a nice clean horizon line in the back. Moving on to the ocean scene, we're going to paint that furthest back island. And so I'm just getting some watered down Alizarin Crimson, and you can take the liberty of how you want these mountains in the back to be designed. And I'm just taking this across my paper. I want to make sure that I have that orange glow showing above my mountains in some way. And then I'm going to make a nice straight edge along the bottom of where this is. And I lined mine up with the previous scene just for continuity purposes. I thought that looked really nice and it felt good to look at. So filling that all in, and while it's wet, you just want to get a tiny bit of ultramarine blue and dab some of that color in along the tops of these mountains and just let it bleed itself out. You want the watercolor to paint itself in this part. It'll give it some texture and some dimension. Now, if you've never done dry brushing, this is something I would practice. You want paint on your brush, but not too much and not too much water, and you're gonna lightly glide it across the paper. This is really successful if your paper has a rough texture to it. I'm using Arches 140 pound rough paper here and lightly gliding my brush across the surface there. You can see where the paint skips a couple beats and we have that orange color showing through. This is to give the sense that there is some sparkle and you have a reflection of the sky showing through, and that's why we painted that orange underneath. Of course, you could always put an orange glaze or something on top at a later point if you would like to, but this is how I find it to be most successful. Phthalo Blue is a staining paint. It has more of a green color to it and it's very strong. So I'm going to use this to mix up a Pacific Northwest evergreen style green for these mountain trees. So I used Phthalo Blue, a little bit of yellow ochre, and then I played around with adding some Ultramarine Blue and some Burnt Sienna until I got it to where it was this kind of bluish green that really just felt awesome. We're gonna paint each mountain in this particular scene in sections. So we want the one that's furthest back to be the lightest. Now I'm coming in with clean water and I drew a slanted sort of mass of land there. With the tip of my brush, I'm just painting a very light version of that color we mixed up into the dry part and pulling that down into where I painted that water. That color will then bleed into there nice and soft and it will feel like fog. Once we do that part of it, we're going to let that dry. Back to our desert scene, I want a gray blue or a light ultramarine blue, something very light in color for this far away mountain range in the desert. It's not these big mountains like you see in the ocean. These need to be small and feel like they're far away. Then while that's drying, we're going to go back to our ocean scene and we're going to mix up a really dark, almost black purple. So I'm using Alizarin Crimson, Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Sienna, and mixing up a really nice dark, deep purple. And this is going to be our landmass that's closest to us. We're going to paint it right over the red one. And again, you can decide how you want this to go. That red mountain should be fully dry before you move on to this. So if it's not, make sure that you hit it with the blow dryer or go grab a snack while you're waiting for it to dry. Now, what's really important is you want to leave a little sliver of that red mountain along the bottom. This really sets the scene that this is water, maybe there's a beach there or there's waves or something, and it really helps your water and land mass feel cohesive. Then I'm going to use just a little bit of gray blue, something a little bit darker, to put some ideas of waves or water ripples in here, not covering up my dry brush, but just giving a little added texture. And then we can do some birds. Now, birds are really fun. You can do a swoosh and then do the other wing and leave a little gap close to where the head would be. And from a distance, it's really successful and it feels like, hey, there's a bird that's got a head. So swoosh and then another little tiny line that almost touches the head, but not quite fully. And so that's a really successful way that I found to do birds. Now we're coming back into our forest mountain scene. We're going on to the next mountain range here, and we want that to be darker than the previous one. I laid down my water, and I'm going to wet on dry, start painting in some trees with some texture until that color meets the water. And When it does that, it will disperse itself, it will kind of bleed out and give this really nice soft effect and feel, which is a great way to do fog or give the idea that there is some fog and it's just softer in there. You can always add more color to that water and use a paper towel to kind of move it around. But this is a really effective way to do trees and fog. So I'm just laying in these trees of various heights. Some are various colors and value. Some of them, my brush has a little bit more water than paint, which can mean that that tree is a little bit further back than the tree before it. So don't be afraid to kind of play around with this and just use the tip of your brush to kind of dot left and right or swoop left and right. Lots more water here. And then I'm using my paper towel to kind of move that water and soften it at the bottom so I don't get a real hard edge. And then I'm going to do one on the other side. So I've got my water on my paper already and I'm mixing up more color but darker. And these trees are going to have more detail. They're going to be slightly bigger. The closer my trees get to me, they're going to be bigger and have more detail. This is a nice dark color, and all I did was just add more of the same colors I was mixing before. So the Pthalo Blue, Ultramarine Blue, Burnt Sienna, Raw Sienna, or Yellow Ochre, and just a combination to get to this place here. And you can see that my paper on the right-hand side is still a little bit wet, which I thought was great because it just gives it this soft feel. So I'm just painting it down until it hits that water and letting the watercolor paint itself. And then I can come in with more color at the bottom and really just add some more depth down there. I can use a paper towel to kind of move it around if I want to. Just have fun with it. Don't be afraid to play with it, but the key is putting your water down and painting into the water from the dry section. Now, while that's drying, we're gonna go back to our desert scene, adding a little bit of burnt sienna to this yellow ochre, starting to put some little shrubs and bushes in here in the distance. Now this is going on pretty dark. I want what's in the foreground or what's going to be in the foreground to be the darkest. So I wet my brush a little bit and I kind of worked that paint a little bit more just to soften it. And I can go back in here, dry my brush off, and then pull a little bit of that color and softening that and giving it some texture and softness so that it's not just these hard little dotted edges everywhere. And that's really important. Then I have that paint on my brush from lifting that paint off my paper, and I can start to define a little dirt road here and putting in some texture there, and then going back to my palette and getting some more yellow ochre and adding some different hues of color in here and some more yellow warm tones. And then you can lift some of the paint out on the dirt road, and I just got a clean wet brush and worked that paint back and forth and then dabbed it with my paper towel just to lighten it up a little tiny bit. And then going back and adding some really dark texture, and I just got more burnt sienna in my paint mix and adding a few little strokes here and there, and then also add some texture, and as it gets closer to you, it's going to get darker. So making sure that you have a good value progression from the foreground to the background. You don't have too much dark in the back. That's looking pretty good. I think that one might be good to go. Let's go back and put the final trees in this mountain forest scene. I want these to be almost black, and my go-to for black is Ultramarine Blue and Burnt Sienna. So I'm mixing that up. I add a little bit of Pthalo Blue here just to kind of really punch that. And it's okay if you paint over some of the trees that you already painted. Now, this swatch is dry. If I were to go back over this when it was wet, these trees would bleed out all over the place. So I want to make sure that I'm going back in when it's dry. And if there's anywhere that I want it to be wet, then I'm going to be putting water down in that area so I have more control over it. But when you paint over the trees in the background, it really tells the viewer that there are trees behind this tree and you don't have to paint them in later. So don't be so upset if you're like, oh my gosh, I already painted this tree, now I'm painting over it. That's totally fine. That's what we're supposed to be doing. So I'm painting these very dark trees in the front and, kind of mixing in and having some of these lighter areas along the bottom and just kind of playing with it. But that's how you would do these 3 scenes and playing with mixing a really basic palette. There's so much you can do with just this handful of colors. Don't be afraid to have a good time and experiment. That's what watercolor's all about. Thanks for hanging out. I hope that you learned something. My goal is for you to be able to learn and feel confident in watercolor. And if you did find this valuable, please like and subscribe to my channel. Turn the notifications on if you want to see more of what I do. And I'll see you next time when I make stuff.
They wonder how I do it like that. 7 fit flex on the jacks on that.